Our nation is broken. We've had political assassinations recently in Minnesota. We had an attempted assassination on the governor of Pennsylvania. And we had an attempted assassination on a presidential candidate and former president of the United States, and now current president of the United States. Nothing I say can unite us as a country. Nothing I can say right now can fix what is broken. Nothing I can say can bring back Charlie Kirk.
The show with Spencer Cox, who is the governor of Utah, and we might want to talk about him a little bit, Neil, because he's been really kind of a steady rod in the last few days as the FBI has been searching for the person who killed Charlie Kirk. We're going to get to that in a minute, but I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil Young.
And we're here on the How Do We Fix This edition, in which we have taken a couple of days to really sit with the assassination of social media influencer and Turning Point USA founder and CEO, Charlie Kirk. We're skipping the In the News segment today because we think this is pretty serious news. Usually in the news, we get kind of light. I'm certainly very sarcastic. I don't think that's appropriate for this moment. And we'd also like to begin by expressing our sorrow at this event, our exhaustion at the ongoing plague of gun violence in the United States, and our heartfelt sympathy for Kirk's parents, his wife Erica, and his two children. And I think, there are a great many people out there who never knew Charlie Kirk, that because he was such a vibrant media personality on the right, they believed he was their friend, and they are feeling this loss as they feel the loss of a friend or a family member. So we want to extend our heartfelt condolences to those who are mourning his loss. Neil, let's just jump into it. FBI has someone in custody, or I guess maybe even it's the local police has someone in custody whose name is Tyler Robinson. He's 22 years old. He was apparently identified by family members. That's where he's been. He's been home, and they tried to get him to turn himself in, and he said no. And so the father communicated with a youth minister who then went to the police. Apparently the youth minister is also involved with the police. And Tyler Robinson is in custody. Neil, you picked up some chatter on the internet about Tyler Robinson that we can't confirm at this point, but can you build out a picture of who he is?
Yeah, I mean, we should say that this hasn't been verified, but I am seeing a lot of accounts say that he's a former Mormon missionary and an Eagle Scout, and that his parents are registered Republicans. Again, I haven't seen that yet verified by news accounts, but it is being put out there by folks who seem to know him personally. We'll know more, obviously, in the hours and days to come. Just all of this is terrible. I think, it'll be interesting to see what the sort of biographical details there are, and also how those details get handled by this administration, I guess is one way to put it.
Yeah, and I think, one theme we're going to want to be tracking, which you are our local expert on, is religion. It seems that there's going to be a lot swirling around in terms of religion here. And I just wanted to note, actually, something I saw in the Wall Street Journal today. Peggy Noonan wrote a column about thoughts and prayers and the ways in which many of us sort of push back on the thoughts and prayers response to gun violence. And she said, for people who pray, actually, God is a living, active presence on earth. And so praying is not doing something.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit, Neil? Because I think there are a lot of people for whom prayer right now is going to be a real comfort and a rock.
Yeah, I haven't read the Noonan piece yet, but I will say that I've always had a bit of an annoyance with that sort of glib mocking of thoughts and prayers by it tends to be sort of folks on the left, just again, coming from the background I came from of, devout evangelicals in which prayer is an active daily activity.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, a force through which one influences the world. So the sort of, and I get that, secular folks don't necessarily understand that or even, believe in that or agree with that or whatever. But it's just to say that when folks say they are praying, they literally mean that they're doing that, and that they have a huge belief that that is a powerful force of action. And so I'm seeing tons and tons of that sort of expression in my feed from, friends and family members who are deeply affected by this and who are heartbroken by it. And we can talk more about that, I think, in this conversation. But yeah, I think that I'm glad you sort of started there, because I think it's important to think about the ways in which people believe that they are agents of change in moments like this.
Yeah. And also that religion is really framing this story in ways that I think we need to pause on a little bit. Charlie Kirk was a extremely divisive figure on earth. I don't think that's an uncontroversial thing to say. He was despised by some Americans and others revered him. And currently those people who were Charlie Kirk fans are honoring him as a martyr, almost as a messianic figure. Christian nationalist influencer Jack Posobiec wrote on September 11th that Kirk, quote, died as he lived, bold, steadfast, and unashamed of the gospel and the truth. But it's also the fact that Kirk was a Christian nationalist. He put faith to work to enforce an extremist agenda that made him a lightning rod for people who were more moderate and or on the left. So there's a few culture wars issues Kirk promoted actively. Can we talk about that, Neil? What were they?
Yeah, I mean, I think extreme white nationalism, I would say, an enormous immigration politics, certainly a virulent anti-trans and I would say even anti-LGBTQ agenda. Those are the three that really come top to mind. Also, I think probably, highly relevant to this conversation, obviously, is a steadfast commitment to the Second Amendment, and not even to the Second Amendment. I mean, that's the wrong way to frame this, but a sort of zeal for guns and an advocacy for guns to be everywhere in our nation. So those are 3 or 4 things that jump out to me.
Yeah. And of course, as I noted in my post yesterday, Kirk famously said that, there should be no limits on guns. And if some innocent lives were lost, that was a price to pay. I find it ironic and twisted that his was the innocent life. And I also want to toss it in that I said that on Facebook, and a couple of my friends jumped in and said he wasn't innocent. And I think that's the kind of thing I want to start to get a grip on in our conversation today, Neil, because he had never been convicted of a crime. You
Yeah,
might, in fact, hate everything he stood for, but being executed publicly in front of a bunch of horrified children, basically,
absolutely.
um, is not something we can condone. What do we mean by someone being innocent, and how does the idea of innocence particularly inflect this situation, Neil?
Yeah, it's such a huge question because it feels like what's at the heart of this whole week and everyone's different responses to this. I mean, I can't speak for those people who said those things in your feed, but I wonder if their logic is that, well, he was a person who incited violence, and so therefore he's not innocent. I don't know, but even that doesn't seem to me to merit political violence like this. And I think I don't know, I just feel like it's both easy and sort of required to have opposition to violence of this nature, period. And that anyone impacted by it is innocent because of the very nature of the act itself. But I know lots of people disagree with that. But I think that's sort of where I'm landing on that.
Yeah, well, you're kind of pointing to the difference between words and deeds, too. And one of the things I've noticed across the political spectrum is that there is a real confusion as to what role words play in actual harm. And
Yeah.
I think there's some culpability for that among liberals, among educational institutions, but also there are a lot of people on Facebook and X and Blue Sky and so on who will frame political opposition to them, sometimes quite harmful political opposition, like anti trans rhetoric, anti trans laws, and so on, and respond to that by saying, "You are literally killing me." And that makes me wonder whether there is also a kind of broad based inability for people with political differences to recognize their common humanity and the possibility of living in community with difference. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's been the heartbreaking part of this for me of the week, and seeing and just feeling like what all this represents about sort of how broken our political culture, just our culture is, and just how broken people are. I think that, oh gosh, I have so many thoughts here. It's hard to know how to sort of really organize them. But I think that one of the things you see is this sort of jarring, at least in the feed that I'm getting, this sort of jarring mix of folks posting these pictures of him with his family or his wife and his two children, and them just expressing their devastation. And then the next meme I see is some absolutely hateful, awful thing he said. And the person posting that, I can't speak to what their full thoughts are behind that, but I do think that a lot of that is sort of like, therefore, these words not necessarily merit the action, but make people unsympathetic to what has happened. And I don't know, but all that seems to be like what you're saying is like an inability to connect across humanity and to recognize humanity. I think that's like really important on your part, an important observation on your part of just sort of the inability to understand one another's humans. I would say Charlie Kirk himself had that inability, and that
Yes.
that was at the heart of his politics. I mean, what we're talking about here is empathy, right?
Right. Right.
And one of the quotes I see being passed around a lot this week is him saying he didn't think empathy was actually a thing, that it was sort of an invented concoction by liberals, and it wasn't a word and it wasn't a concept. And so he didn't share so many of, I think, the perspectives that we're talking about right now about basic humanity of others. In fact, I think he really cultivated a politics of difference and of dehumanization and all the rest. And also, that doesn't deserve what happened to him.
Right. I mean, there's no equality of offense here. And as we continue today's broadcast, we'll continue to deplore the violent death, and it's also necessary to take full account of Charlie Kirk's life, his repeated utterances that denigrated Black people, particularly Black women, immigrants, women of all kinds, LGBT people. He was well into a divisive MAGA culture war. But one of the things I was also thinking about, just coincidentally, I happened to be reading Geraldine Brooks's Memorial Days, which is about the
Mm.
aftermath of the sudden death by natural causes of her husband, Tony Horwitz. And it's just an excruciating description of grief and what follows a sudden death, particularly of a younger man. And I suddenly thought of Kirk's wife, Erica, who is faced with raising two small children by herself. They have more than enough money, so that's not the issue, but that she will have to continue being a mother at the same time as she copes with this drastic rearrangement of her life and the loss of her partner and lover. And I've been just sort of sitting with it today. What does it mean to feel empathy for someone on the right who actually might not feel empathy for me, but to feel that empathy anyway, to say, boy, actually, she's really going through it, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak for myself, but for me, that's vital. It's vital to myself and to
Yeah.
my politics and to my worldview that a moment like this requires that from me, because it's sort of what everything is predicated on how I see the world and how I want the world to be. So, and it's hard. It's really
Right.
hard.
Right.
But I think because it's hard is why it matters. And I think that I'm struggling with my words today because I think this is just such a shocking thing, even a couple days later. And also because I feel like this is a conversation that requires carefulness. And I will say that, in this work, and particularly as historians, we are so often called upon to comment on historical figures who have
Right.
died, right? I mean, I've
Right.
written lots and lots of columns, I've done lots of podcasts about people who've died, in the past. Almost all of them are dying at a very long and, I suppose, happy life, right? And so there's a way in which I'm thinking about like the column I wrote when Rush Limbaugh died.
Mm-hmm.
Even someone who, is died of cancer, and that's a horrible, horrible thing to happen to a person, and F cancer and all the rest. And also, like, he was, at the end of a very long life. And so in that situation, I think it's easy to feel a little bit more freedom to sort of fully assess a person and to like weigh in on the things that you really oppose. This feels different. I mean, to have a person brutally murdered at this stage of their life, I just think it doesn't mean we can't talk about what he did and what he represented, but I think it comes with a lot more sort of caveats and a lot more sort of framing of that conversation than I don't know, a Henry Kissinger type.
Right. Right. No, I agree with you. And I think the shocking, sudden violence of it. I mean, I remember watching the film of George Floyd being murdered by police, and it was devastating. I don't think I'd ever seen somebody die like that. I had
Yeah.
seen my father die, but I'd never seen anybody die like that. And similarly, I sort of couldn't help myself and I sought out the video of the moment that Charlie Kirk was shot, which I had mixed feelings about. And listeners, I would not recommend looking at it. You really can't unsee it. And certainly I'd never seen anybody die like that, although other people I know have. And I think I keep thinking this ought to be the shocking thing that jolts people back, kind of like an electroshock treatment that jolts people back into the real world. But that didn't happen. And we're going to talk a little bit about what did happen. But I want to back us up a little bit, Neil, and talk about who Charlie Kirk was. I'm glad you mentioned Rush Limbaugh because he was inspired by Rush Limbaugh. He is credited with having brought the conservative media landscape into the 21st century as Limbaugh really changed the politics of the 20th century. He founded Turning Point USA in 2012 as an 18-year-old college dropout. He appears to have been extremely well liked in MAGA Republican circles, and he played a critical role in mobilizing the youth vote for Donald Trump in 2024. One source has pegged his net worth at 12 million. It is not unlucrative to be a media personality in the MAGA world. What else do we need to know about him, Neil?
Well, I think that his influence on and connection to Trump and the Trump family is really important here too. They were pretty tight. And I think, obviously he did a lot of I think he did a lot of like promoting of Trump policies and sort of Trump as candidate in his conservative circles. But I think also thinking about the relationship with the administration and with the Trump family itself is also important as well here.
Yeah, and apparently Donald Trump was really fond of him to the extent that Donald Trump is fond of anybody, that he was really jolted by this. Donald Trump Jr. was a particular friend of Charlie Kirk's. Apparently J.D. Vance was as well. I think we're going to see a lot of people sort of revealing themselves as close friends of Kirk's
Yeah.
who really weren't.
Yeah.
But I would also say that he is credited by some people, and liberals like Ezra Klein sort of jumped in on this one, that he believed in debate and he believed in the free exchange of ideas, and this made him unusual and special. I do you think that's true?
I think that is a overinterpretation of his work and his life. He certainly engaged in debate. That was part of like his sort of platform, and I would say even in a way a shtick, because I'm not sure he believes so much in the free and open exchange of ideas and like the sort of hallmarks of debate as much as he used the format of debate to set up the points he wanted to make. He sort of like to enhance the politics he believed in. I mean, the debates he shared with his viewers were one in which almost always the person on the other side was a caricature of the left, right? Sort of an extreme version. And so much of the debate was about humiliating that person.
Right.
And so what I think it demonstrated was not so much this Ezra Klein's notion of like a, hearty and, full-hearted belief in the openness of rational exchange and, the processes of inquiry and debate, but again, debate as a tool by which to obliterate and objectify and dehumanize the other side. So I think that that's really important to note here because I think those who are non-conservatives have an important role to play here in deploring the violence and condemning it, but I don't think they should participate in the sort of glorification of this person that's detached from reality. Like those two things don't have to happen together.
Right. Right. Well, and it's interesting because I did not used to be an Ezra Klein fan, and now I am. I found him a very acquired taste because he reminded me of every single boy I knew sitting around the breakfast table at Yale, just sort of spouting opinions in this utterly reasonable way. But it did occur to me that there was a kind of initial burst of generosity among liberal and left commentators, official ones. I'm not talking about your average Yahoo on Twitter, but, like Ezra was being generous, right? That impulse did not arise among MAGA partisans, did it?
No, and I think that that's where, it's like on one hand, I think it's wonderful for folks to model that, right? Like just show that. But also, I think it's important to point out that this is not a shared response. It's not a shared sort of way of being. That generosity and that sort of good faith sort of treatment of others and of points of difference isn't commonly held. And we shouldn't pretend like it is, and we shouldn't ascribe it to persons, even persons who've met such tragic ends.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I saw, I mean, the first I knew that Kirk had been shot was when you texted me. And so, of course, I immediately jumped on X to see what I could find. Within minutes of Kirk being shot, I was seeing reporters from Fox, reporters from the Washington Examiner, people who are actually employed as journalists on the right, posting things like Democrats did this.
Yep.
And I have not thought anything could shock me in the media sphere for a long time, but that really did shock me. There was no suspect in custody. Nobody knew anything about it. There was no manifesto. Democrats did this. And it's a kind of framework that is useful even when new information comes in. That, sort of now the framing has shifted of like, well, this guy might be a white man and he might be a Mormon and his parents might be Republicans, but it's the Democrats that created the political divisions that motivated him. How do we think about this, Neil? How do we think about correcting something that we as liberals are not in charge of?
You mean in terms of like media culture on the right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that it can be corrected because like it's its own, well sealed universe into itself. I mean, it's a bubble that like doesn't allow, outside intervention.
Right.
But I think that one thing I've been thinking about is like just how we go about our own personal relationships and how maybe we can model this through our one-on-one relationships, and that maybe that's the only place where like change and connection can still happen, and that can offset some of this stuff. It can be a bit of a break on those things, but I don't know. But I do think it's like absolutely a dereliction of duty for those who call themselves journalists to conduct themselves in such ways. I do think a lot of people on the left behave this way when a school shooting happens. But I think, for like individual Twitter accounts and like regular folks like that to have that sort of knee-jerk reaction is very different than like media figures and like people with institutional power to disseminate that stuff immediately. And also we should say the president of the United States said similar
Right.
words
Right.
shortly thereafter. So it's a leadership problem. And I think in some ways that also points us to what you raised a little bit earlier about Governor Cox. And there's a real difference here between the governor of Utah and the way he's handled this, and the way he's spoken about this, a Republican, very conservative governor, and the way that the president of the United States is handling this, and just the absolute divide that shows in what proper leadership in this moment is. That you don't speculate, you don't consort and conspiracy think. You speak cautiously, and you repeatedly say that we're waiting on evidence to come, and that you wait for that evidence to come before you make any sort of bigger statements about it. But that's not how the president operates. So it's not surprising that the conservative media empire that props him up also behaves the same way.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I mean, I don't think it goes too far to say that Charlie Kirk was destroyed by a world that he helped to make in some regards. But someone like Spencer Cox does represent some other possibility on the right. And, I'm going to confess something right now, which is I've actually always liked Spencer Cox.
Hmm.
And it's part of my perhaps fatal ecumenicism that despite the fact that he signed off on things like anti-LGBT bills, I've always thought that he comported himself with a kind of dignity and empathy, the word of the day, that other Republicans don't. And I was watching him in that initial press conference. First of all, he seemed to be close to tears the entire time, which it's just nice to see a Republican that has feelings every once in a while and who expresses them. And secondly, I immediately thought, why isn't this guy running for president in 2028? He actually would be the kind of person that the center would vote for and be a stark contrast to Donald Trump. I don't think he's MAGA in those ways. I think he's very conservative. He's obviously very Mormon. But I don't know. Am I overreading? Am I just like suffering from Stockholm syndrome here, Neil?
Well, I had the same sort of thought that like maybe this is a moment in which he's elevated into a national stage by which, he becomes a viable political candidate for 2028. I mean, obviously everyone I think knows his name now, which is a huge platform. And also he's conducting himself, I think, very admirably. And I think you're really right to point out that emotional response. I mean, there's lots of feelings being expressed, Claire.
Right.
It's not that Republicans don't have feelings. It's that the feelings we see are anger, rage, vengeance.
Right.
I guess vengeance isn't necessarily a feeling, but anger and rage. So to see someone who has what feels like a deeply human, compassionate response that feels non-political, but feels just human and humane, is a absolute breath of fresh air for all of us who are worried about the absolute collapse that the Republicans have committed themselves to as they, just chase the Trump tail. So yes, that would be wonderful to have someone who recognized that their path towards a bigger stage might be through a different version of republicanism, one that I think hews a little bit more towards examples from the past than our current model. We'll see. And I also really hope that he'll continue to operate in this vein.
Yeah, I do too. So let's pivot back to Charlie Kirk and who he was, what he did. First of all, first and foremost, he was a youth organizer. He was a campus organizer. And that has a long history in the Republican Party, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so much of the modern conservative movement was built on college students and through college networks. Think about Young Americans for Freedom, College Republicans, and all sorts of other bedrock conservative organizations that were focused on sort of this demographic and that understood, smartly so, that like generational change could happen if it was sort of focused on the youngest political actors who you could make into like lifelong conservatives. So it's very much a piece of that history.
Yeah. Well, and let's name some names. Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, they got their starts in college Republicans. And then there used to be something called Young Republicans, which I think still exists. I think there's a
Yeah.
chapter in Manhattan. Didn't you speak before the Young Republicans in Manhattan? Or was
No,
that
I
the Teddy
spoke.
Roosevelt Club?
No, I spoke before the log cabin chapter
Okay,
in New
the
York
log
City.
cabins. There
Not as a
are,
fellow traveler, but as a person who'd written a book about them, just to be clear.
just to be clear, but those organizations really trained people who were already dedicated conservatives in the act of being in politics. It's something that's almost disappeared because people jump from, a dynamite Discord presence or X presence or something like that right back in. CPAC has also changed that. Instead of organizing on campuses, they organize people at CPAC and send them back to their campuses. And Kirk was really like that too. I mean, he went from campus to campus holding these debates, which were called Prove Me Wrong. They could have easily, as you suggested, have been called I'm going to prove you wrong. And, on the one hand, I think they were very exciting for students. I think they created a kind of community for students that often campuses don't do for them. But then they also became fodder for more social media presence. So they would go up, little snippets of it. As you said, watch Charlie crush the woke mob.
Right.
And lots of figures on the right started doing this. Kash Patel started doing this. Dinesh D'Souza started doing it. Ann Coulter does it, and so you can just see these tiny videos of some adult reducing a child to tears of frustration as they insist that they're right. And I want to get back to this question of debate. They weren't really debates, were they?
Right. No, they weren't. I mean, they were again, like I said before, they were sort of opportunities for humiliation and for just sort of trouncing the opposition. I mean, particularly in terms of the ones that were broadcast out to TikTok and to the other social media spaces, right? I imagine they didn't all necessarily play out this way in person, but the ones that were curated for his social media audiences were ones in which debate wasn't what was happening as much as sort of like a premise was put up or a question was raised. And then Charlie Kirk devastated the opponent and sent them away with their tail between their legs. But I think all this points to his harnessing of existing technology and in the way that, again, like a Rush Limbaugh did in a talk radio age and that other conservatives have done in other moments of media history, that he really was someone that was primed for this sort of digital age and the sort of quick snippets that exist on social media and he really set, as you said, he set a format that became adopted across the right. And I think a lot on the left are trying to copy as well.
Right. And I don't really think there is much copying it. And maybe we should talk about that. But it's also the case that what Kirk did was target not just college students, but high school students, middle school students, basically anyone with a phone. And a mutual friend of ours, who I will not name because I didn't ask permission to do so, told me that her son had begun, when he turned about 13 or 14, began to automatically get Charlie Kirk videos in his various social media feeds and was watching them. Fortunately, has a good relationship with his parents and said, God, I'm seeing these great videos. They're so interesting. I really like this guy. And our friend was like, whoa, let's sit down and talk about this. And she spent hours apparently watching the videos with him. And he would say, see, he really made a good point. And our friend would say, well, yes, except that it's not true. Let's look it up on the internet, right?
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that's really interesting about what Kirk and other social media influencers have figured out is you could actually deliver a lot of information in a very short amount of time that even if parents are paying attention, it takes an awful lot to undo it.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of teaching to actually reverse that thinking and say, all right, I need you to think critically about this. I need you to not just adopt things you're hearing as if they're true. You need to check them out. And so I think Kirk's debates and the various films he sent around, and let me just say, his podcasts were actually a great deal more inflammatory than the debates. And, you really had to go to the podcast films to see the most atrocious and offensive and ugly things that he had to say.
Yeah. And, it's one of those things where he talked so much. I mean, there's literally millions of words are part of his body of work, given, the nature of what he was doing. So It's a little hard for me to know, as someone who wasn't like immersed in it, obviously, but was sort of generally aware of it. It's sort of hard to me for me to know, like, how do you talk about a person who talked so much, and like what were their politics? Because I think that politics was like always evolving and changing, and so I've seen some people say like, oh, he started out this way and it was more sort of inflammatory and divisive, but he really had moved towards this more sort of open exchange and this like dialogue model. And so
Yeah.
there's folks making that point, and then there's other folks saying like, well, X years ago he said that like gay people were welcome in the conservative movement, but this is what he said more recently. So not that we should necessarily expect any public figure of this nature to have a wholly consistent and coherent like ideology and set of statements, but it does seem like there's a lot of divergence over, or a lot of differences over this period that like sort of makes it hard to actually like conclude or say definitively about who he was and what his politics were. And maybe that makes him actually more interesting, but it seems like every sort of statement I've seen someone upholding, there's been another statement that contradicts that.
I think that's right. And I also think we forget that people are different things to different people.
Right.
My friend Ryan Gordusky wrote a short post about him on his newsletter and pointed to a moment in which he, Ryan, had said something nasty about Kirk on Twitter. And Kirk reached out to him in a private message and said, hey, can we talk about this? And that was a sort of demonstration of like, actually, a lot of people on the right are at each other's throats all the
Yes.
time for like deviationism, for, saying that they're nuts or they're retarded is a word that gets bandied around, and it's a really bad word. Don't use it. But there's a big defense of it on the right, that's a perfect put down for people. And Kirk apparently wasn't like that to other people on the right, but he was like that to people who were liberals or on the left. And so, depending on the audience, he could really shapeshift a fair amount, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in one way that's like how a lot of politicians act, right? Like,
Right.
and how a lot of, Reagan was a famous
Right.
example of that, of how he could be sort of like, um, someone for everyone, and a person for all people. And also, I think like these different sort of formats of media also bring out sort of different components of a person, and also because of the different nature of their audiences, like
Yeah.
one is
Right.
going to act differently in them. But I do think you raise another point that I did want us to get to, which is like the division over him on the right,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that that's an important part of this story, and especially the far right. I mean, there is a far right beyond Charlie Kirk, which is
Right.
worth remembering, and that they really hate Charlie Kirk. And that's folks like Nick Fuentes and the sort of Proud Boys movement, and that wing of the like far right, highly online, internet
Right.
bros. And like, we're not going to engage in conspiracy here, but I have seen online speculation that like maybe this assassin is sort of from that crowd. And so again, we're not going to like give that air as much as I'm just noting that that's like a theory that's out there. But I do think it's important for us to think about sort of divisions across the right and Charlie Kirk's place in that, as we also think about his sort of inability to reach across the political divide that he said he wanted to, but like in a way that didn't allow him to honor and to even see other people's like humanity and basic value of their existence.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for pointing out that there are people to the right of Charlie Kirk. And of course, Fuentes' movement calls itself the Groypers. And they are very much not just online, but in the Discord channels that
Yeah.
apparently this guy was in. I'm just going to add another random thought to this. I did think that this person might be a Groyper. I also had this thought of like, this person could be a fundamentalist Mormon because they really do that shit.
Yeah.
There's a long history of punishing people through what do they call it, a blood something
Blood
or other,
vengeance.
blood vengeance, right? And I thought, there are all these communities of fundamentalist Mormons in Utah and Arizona that this person could just disappear into. I did
Yeah,
have that thought.
and I believe he is from southern Utah.
Right.
I believe that's where he was apprehended, at his home in southern Utah, like 200 plus miles away from the
Right.
event.
Right.
And southern Utah, northern Arizona is a particular hotbed of that separatist, fundamentalist Mormonism. So, yeah, I mean, again, we have a lot to learn here, and this is
Right.
all unverified, but
Right.
perhaps relevant context.
Yeah, we don't know. We're eager to learn more. A couple of other things that I'd like to land on. One is there was an upsurge of religious imagery and conversation in the aftermath of the shooting. Kirk was compared by some of his admirers to Jesus and to Martin Luther King, which is a weird contradiction when we take into account the fact that Charlie Kirk actually reviled Dr. King over and over and over again. Others referred to Kirk as a martyr and as a messiah. On Facebook, the Christian singer Pat Boone, who knew Pat Boone was still alive? The Christian singer you did? Of course you did. Christian singer Pat Boone called him an apostle. He said Charlie Kirk is an apostle. How do we understand this, Neil? How is it that he has been turned into a sacred figure so quickly?
Well, I'll just say on the Pat Boone thing, I know he's still alive because I've often thought I might want to write a biography about him one day, but also he's
still alive.
He's still alive, and also he says things like this that make me think, no, I actually don't want to spend a lot of time with him. But anyway, your question was not about Pat Boone. It was about how do we make sense of the martyrdom of Charlie Kirk?
That he became a sacred figure almost right away. I mean, is the context the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, after which there was an upsurge of conversation that he must be blessed by God to come and save us all? What is this about? Help us out here.
I think that's part of the context, but I actually think that part of the context is more how most of Trump, at least these sorts of folks, know that Trump is not a religious figure, that he does not actually share their religious beliefs, that he may be a carrier of them, but he is not an embodier of them. And so I think in the sort of vacuum that Trump has created, in which like religious conservatism is at the forefront, but it's not being embodied by this person in the White House, it's someone like Charlie Kirk fills that void. And I think it's especially important that he's so young. Obviously, it's important that he's white. I mean, I think we should say that. And that he was sort of outspoken about his religious beliefs and a constant advocate of being a Christian. And I think that like a lot of my friends who are posting things, I mean, I'm awash in Charlie Kirk martyrdom content right now, thanks to like, people I grew up with and who I still call friends. And the stuff that they are posting is like these snips of him, just saying, yes, I'm a Christian. And the sort of apologetics that he would often do for the Christian faith. And I do wonder, how much any of these folks were actually like devotees of him and actually like consumed his content. Right. Or if more he sort of was a representative figure. I mean, I think that's probably the case for a lot of them.
Right.
And in that representativeness, I think it's so much easier to make him a martyr if you don't actually know all that much about him, or you aren't fully immersed in like all his content. Not to say that might not be the case too, but I do think that a lot of this is about the way in which Trump isn't the embodiment and doesn't believe in the things that like Charlie Kirk does, even as he gives like lip service to those things.
So we need another figure to actually carry the weight of that. I mean, it's interesting because J.D. Vance is so not charismatic. I actually do believe he's a person of faith. Everything he has said and the ways that he behaves, and let's bracket the actual opinions up that he has and the policies he supports. But he does, in fact, present as a genuine Christian, but he's not charismatic. And of course, Kirk was said to be incredibly charismatic. I don't really see it, but I actually think seeing someone online without seeing them in person is different. I remember when I first saw Trump in person, I got it completely. Why people thought he was charismatic, and I had never gotten it on television. Yeah, completely. How he is with the crowd. Or when I went to CPAC, there were a number of conservative speakers like Laura Ingraham, who I think is just a complete idiot. But the speech she gave to the students was so powerful and so energizing. And that leads me to think about this whole question of community, that it seems like the right in the, through people like Charlie Kirk are creating real communities, and liberals and the left maybe aren't.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of sociologists and political scientists have, spilled a lot of ink over this very point, especially of late. I also think that like there are sort of built-in institutional structures that are in healthier shape on the right than they are on the left, namely churches and parachurch organizations and religious ministries, and that this is a vast and vibrant and interconnected network that overlaps with a lot of this stuff. So it's a very interconnected world that reinforces community and belonging and identity.
Right.
And I think all those are sort of powerfully invoked and activated in moments like this.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I have seen with young conservatives that I have interviewed or gotten to know over time is they almost universally have had, unless they've gone to a Christian college or Hillsdale or something like that, they've had a bad experience in higher education. They have either been punished for speech or most frequently ridiculed by other students for their views. And while some of these people may be exaggerating it a little bit, I saw a really nice kid on the PBS NewsHour last night with Amna Nawaz, who runs a conservative climate organization where he works for climate change with conservatives. He was a good friend of Charlie Kirk's. He said, we disagreed about a lot of things, including the fact that Charlie Kirk did not believe in climate change.
Right.
But this kid was just kind of broken. I mean, he was just kind of crying. And one of the things he talked about was getting to know Charlie because they had both, as college students, been ridiculed by others for being conservative. And this kid stayed in college and Charlie Kirk didn't. But I do wonder whether college and university communities need to think a little harder about their student cultures.
Yes. And I just have a hard time really believing those accounts.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I just don't really trust that story as much as I think it is a discursive practice of the right. I think it is a built-in narrative that feels replicated so frequently that I think it's more, I don't know, not to say that it doesn't or never happens. Absolutely. All sorts of things happen on college campus. But I think I just become a bit suspicious that it seems to be in the biography of every person of this ilk. And so it just it creates skepticism for me. I mean, I do believe that Stephen Miller, as an arch conservative, was ostracized at Santa Monica High School and at Duke University, and that is a huge part of what fuels his rage that he has brought upon all of us. But I just don't know if this is like so widely shared. I bring a lot of distrust to this particular story because we hear it so often.
Yeah, let's hold our distrust, including Stephen Miller was probably a genuinely horrible person as a teenager as well. So that there might have been reasons more than his politics that people disliked him.
Exactly.
I'd also like to say that Utah Valley University, in one ranking, is the 21st most conservative college campus in the country. And I think they ranked something like 200 campuses. There was a petition before Charlie Kirk came urging the administration and the faculty to bar him from having this event. And it went nowhere because Utah has laws about things like about viewpoint neutrality, which I suppose then means you have to have Charlie Kirk. But there were over 1,000 students at the university who signed this petition at this conservative university who thought he would be too divisive to bring to campus. So there are these sort of fissures on the right that get covered up at a moment like this, at a moment of mourning, of genuine mourning, when then there's this sort of overwhelming sense of like, they hate us. And the they does not include other conservatives. And yet there are other conservatives who are profoundly uncomfortable with this approach to politics.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know who those 1,000 students are. And I actually thought I had heard it was more like 6,000. But whatever it was, a lot of students signed this petition. I mean, Utah Valley U is also an enormous public institution. So, even in deeply conservative Utah, and actually in a very conservative part of conservative Utah, I imagine a large public university has like all types of students in it. So, who's to say who the folks were that signed this? But I think it's easy to imagine that there are many folks who were conservative or Republican or not liberal who had real concerns about him being on campus, and that's happened at other places as well.
Yeah. So let's sort of broaden the lens a little bit. In the aftermath of purging experienced investigators and putting two podcasters in charge of the agency, we're up next in the next Democratic administration to run the FBI, Neil.
Their
The
face.
FBI appeared to be in some disarray during the manhunt. Now, I do want to say that suspect was captured within about, I don't know, 32 hours or something like that of the event happening, but only because,
His family
remember,
turned him in.
his family turned him in, and the FBI seemed to be at sixes and sevens. What should we think about this, Neil? I mean, I certainly hope no relative of mine is kidnapped in the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've sort of touched on the FBI several times in recent episodes, and just sort of the poor leadership and poor management there, and this is certainly not a moment in which it showed itself to be, a well led organization, and I don't think it's even going to really rise to the occasion in this, and it really raises my suspicion about everything that happens. I mean, I think a lot of Americans are going to have a hard time trusting any information that comes out going forward about this person and the investigation and everything else, because we know that this organization is being run by political hacks.
Right. And in fact, the special agent in charge in Salt Lake City, otherwise known as the SAC, was removed, presumably because she was a woman. I think she may have been a woman of color. She was a very experienced investigator, and she was removed several months ago in the sort of general political purging. And they had someone in charge who had never run a major investigation. And so there is something at stake here in this sort of Trumpy attitude that anybody who has common sense can do any job in the world. And that is really not true of police work. And it will be interesting, as you suggested, to see as this unrolls, will there be mistakes that have been made that make this prosecution vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to push back a little bit of that like that's the Trump take on things. I mean, I
Huh?
don't think common sense is the thing that they're advocating for. It's identity. It's white men. Obviously, Kash Patel is not a white man, but like the operating assumption or the operating practice of this administration is that folks who are not white men are identity hires and therefore have no capacity to do their job. And the flip of that is white men, by their virtue of being those things, have capacity to do any job.
Right.
And we're seeing the effects of that in all sorts of sectors of government, where one, idiot or just like untrained person after another is being put in charge of things just because they've got the right chromosomes and the right skin tone. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So let's look at another piece of this, which is that this summer, the Utah legislature updated its constitutional carry laws. And constitutional carry basically means practically anybody can get a gun. So they updated their constitutional carry laws to permit students 18 or older to bear arms on a college campus, concealed or openly. Now, under Utah law, and this is constitutional carry, a gun owner does not need a permit as long as they carry the weapon openly. You only need a permit if you want to conceal your weapon, which all seems like ridiculous safety gibberish to me. But A, there never should have been a weapon on that campus, and Utah law made it possible. B, this 22-year-old never should have had access to a weapon, and the Utah law made it possible. And C, there is this paradigm on the right that as long as everybody is armed, no one will get hurt. And in fact, there is no way anybody, whether a citizen or security personnel or something like that, could have responded to the shooter before Charlie Kirk was dead.
Yeah, it's a complete fantasy version of reality that imagines good folks will always intervene and prevent harm. But like, this is a sniper event.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also all the things you just described about the laws in Utah that make this possible are the very things Charlie Kirk advocated for and more. Yeah, I mean, like one thing we haven't really touched upon is sort of his gun rights advocacy and how that, you know, is obviously highly relevant to his own death.
Right. Right.
You know, there's this quote everyone's passing around from just 2 years ago where he, and I think you mentioned this at the top of the show, that, you know, he said that there would be some innocent lives lost, and that's an unfortunate price that we pay for, you know, keeping the Second Amendment freedom. And I just think that those are sort of haunting and chilling words given this result. And also, I think it speaks to a conservative imagination that doesn't believe that reality and that consequence will ever come to them. And that it goes back to like his inability and his refusal to engage in empathy, because empathy is about imagining yourself in other people's shoes and seeing that sort of commonality of experience and possibility of a common experience. And he never thought that this would be a result that he had to pay the price for. And I think that's the real limits of the conservative imagination.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, I mean, one of the things I was seeing on X is people saying you should be able to do a college event without getting assassinated. And I wrote back to one of them, you know, you should be able to go to high school without being assassinated. You should be able to go to a gay dance club without being assassinated. You should be able to be at home, you know, as a Democratic state legislator in Minnesota and be okay. But actually, there's nothing that privileges a Republican media star in this atmosphere. You know, he had his own security team. And yet you realize when you look at the venue, I think the person I felt most sorry for was the head of the campus police, who employs, I think, 6 people. And he said, basically, there wasn't anything we could do. But clearly, even with the addition of the security team, there wasn't anything they could have done to prevent this.
There's literally a security person standing right behind him in all black.
Right.
You know.
Right. Exactly. So, Neil, I was also thinking about political assassination more broadly. And because we're historians, I came up with 2. One was the assassination of Louisiana Democratic Governor Huey P. Long. September 8th, which was only 2 days before Kirk was shot, was the 90th anniversary of Huey Long's assassination. And listeners, if you don't know about Huey Long, if you haven't read All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, he was really a populist challenger to Franklin D. Roosevelt during the 90s, and he was killed by a political opponent. So there's that. The second figure I was thinking about, which is much more recent and immediate, is Andrew Breitbart, who died of natural causes. He had a heart attack, I think, at 43 years old. Breitbart was, of course, the founder of Breitbart News, which was then taken over by Steve Bannon, who turned it into a MAGA powerhouse. Can you think of any other political assassinations that resonate at this moment?
Well, I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. seems important here, especially as he's getting compared to Charlie Kirk by folks who normally don't have much interest or affinity for MLK. The Kennedy, both Robert JFK and Bobby Kennedy. I mean, I think, you know, as much as folks, I think, are lamenting this and saying this doesn't happen in our country, that's not what history shows us. In fact, political assassinations, thankfully, are not a frequent event, but they're not an uncommon event. And so the sort of historical frame is important here. But like this field, I mean, I also think that there's some important differences here just because of like the nature of who he is as a figure.
Right. Right. No, I think you're right. And, you know, one of the things I kept thinking about is the final scene in Nashville in which the Loretta Lynn character is assassinated. But the assassination is really sort of the gunman putting her out of her misery. Like he loves her so much, he doesn't want her to be in pain anymore. So he kills her. Sorry about the spoiler alert there if you haven't seen Nashville.
Never seen it.
Oh my God, it's so good, Neil. We should actually do a Facebook Live about it. But, thinking about the assassinations you're talking about, except for RFK Jr., again, they were people from the right. Thinking about Oswald, he was a Marxist for a while. He went to the Soviet Union. He then came back to the United States. I kept thinking about him. My friend Deanne Stillman has written a book about him as the sort of original lone shooter, a person who wanted so desperately to be famous. And her analysis is that he ultimately figured out the only way he would be remembered in history was by killing Kennedy. And this shooter seems a lot more like that to me. But the Breitbart thing occurred to me, even though he wasn't assassinated, in the sense that he spread conspiracy theories on Breitbart. There has been a conspiracy theory ever since that Andrew Breitbart was really assassinated. And
Mm.
he was an inspiration to lots of young conservatives who then sort of became MAGAs. Breitbart News has become a place that is a sort of stopping off point for a lot of journalists before they move on to the Washington Examiner or the New York Post. And Breitbart was incredibly charismatic and also in some ways cultivated the Manichaean view of the world that we see embodied in people like Charlie Kirk today.
Yeah, he apparently died of a heart attack while he was on a walk in
Yeah,
his neighborhood at the age
yeah,
of 43. And this happened in 2012.
yeah,
And when I was rereading about that, I thought, well, if this had happened post 2020, this would have been like blamed on COVID vaccine, right? Like,
yes,
I mean,
yeah,
think of like every
yeah.
single young man or middle-aged man who dies of heart issues in our post 2021 world is immediately on social media held up as like, a COVID vaccine death.
Yep, absolutely. That seems like a great place to leave it, Neil. And let's move on to what we want to go viral this week. What do you have?
Okay, this is a pretty different vein, and I'm not so sure I want it to go viral as much as I just want to talk about it. But it's a piece in the Atlantic called Texas's Pete by Elaine Godfrey. The subtitle is James Tallarico is young, well-spoken, and eager to talk with Republicans, exactly what some Democratic dreamers think they need to finally turn the state blue. I assume you, Claire, know who James Tallarico is.
I do, but why don't you tell our audience?
Yeah, he's a state Democratic representative in Texas. He's become a bit of a social media phenomenon for actually sort of in a way, I mean, very different from Charlie Kirk, but he's had these sort of viral moments where he's spoken out against legislation in Texas in such sort of like an eloquent and in a lot of ways like a Pete Buttigieg way, like just like he has this real power of sort of delivery and eloquence and sort of advocating like center left politics that, has a real potential for virality in certain social media spaces, speaking out against the 10 Commandments legislation, also speaking out against some sort of anti-LGBTQ stuff in Texas. And he's this like super like clean cut, like, all American, like Boy Scout type, which I think is part of the appeal here, to the extent that he has appeal, certainly part of how he's gone sort of viral over and over again. He just declared that he was throwing his hat into the ring, running for the Democratic nomination for the Senate position to replace John Cornyn. So this article is sort of about, is James Tallarico the next like big hope for Democrats? And it's all these like big name Democrats are weighing in on the piece and talking about, how great he is or whatever. And I've found Tallarico sort of interesting and certainly enjoy watching his little clips. And also it should be noted that he's a Presbyterian minister and a devout
Mm-hmm.
Christian and often
Mm-hmm.
speaks of his politics through a very, very religious discourse, even as they're non-conservative politics. And so all this is like, maybe he's the hope for taking over Texas. And I think, James Tallarico definitely deserves a think piece and more people should know about him. And it's not surprising to me that he's seen as, perhaps a rising figure. But it was so striking to me that, first of all, he's not very likely to win the Democratic nomination. Colin Allred probably will win it. He's way out in front of fundraising. I think he has $100 million in his chest. He's like lots of points ahead in polling right now. but there's not a think piece about Colin Allred,
Right.
who is not white. And also, we have someone named Jasmine Crockett, who is
Who
from
I
Texas,
love.
who is a major social media figure.
Yeah.
And it should be said that the person who wrote this Atlantic piece wrote a piece about Jasmine Crockett earlier this summer. So it's not like, she hasn't gotten any attention from the Atlantic or other places. But I think that there's like something interesting here about the way in which like particular white male Democrats who have just a moment of brush with fame become seen as like the next big hope for the Democratic Party, when you have folks like Jasmine Crockett who are in Congress
Right.
on a huge national platform already, and like that talk never happens. So I don't know, read the piece, it's interesting enough, but I was more sort of interested in like the media phenomenon that like sort of looks to folks like Tallarico in one way and doesn't look to other Democratic stars in the same way. I don't know, just thought it was worth sort of thinking about right now.
It's totally worth thinking about right now. And actually, I think it has a great deal to do with today's subject, because
I agree.
we've been talking about polarization and how to respond to polarization. And I fear that the Democratic Party will respond to this by marginalizing candidates who are routinely lampooned by Republican and MAGA influencers. Jasmine Crockett is one of those people who is routinely lampooned in profoundly racist ways. And what I fear is that the Democratic Party is going to try to feed us some middle of the road type of person like James Tallarico for a presidential candidate, and that we're going to find ourselves in a Walter Mondale situation or a Michael Dukakis type situation in which no one is interested in this person, and that the effort of reaching out, quote unquote, to independents and persuadable Republicans is going to overwhelm what in fact the Democrats need to do for their own people to mobilize them for an election. I don't know. I was having a thought as I was listening to you too, back to the whole question of Charlie Kirk's debates. I would have loved to have seen him debate Maura Healey or Elizabeth
Mm-hmm.
Warren or
Yeah.
J.B. Pritzker, or, debate someone your own size, dude,
Yeah.
and see what, or even James Tallarico for that matter. But that, we're sort of looking at apples and oranges on a
Yeah,
certain level
totally.
about how Republicans are organizing and how Democrats are responding to that. So this is what I would like to go viral this week. And it's a response to what I'm sort of suggesting is a Republican skill, Charlie Kirk's skill at building community for young people who are very lonely. I would like our listeners to go back to Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American Community, which was published by Simon and Schuster in 2000. But really, the research was all done before 1995. So it's a pre-internet account of how community eroded in the United States. And, we talk a lot about the internet as pushing polarization. What we don't talk about is that actually the internet recreated communities that had already fallen apart. And
Mm-hmm.
Putnam talks about the collapse of bowling leagues. He talks about the collapse of parent teacher associations. There's just sort of a range of institutions that used to form communities within our communities or glue our communities together that just collapsed. And that part of the collapse is the economic pressure that people were under from the 90s onward. If you have a stay at home mom, that mom would volunteer for the PTA. If you have a dad that's not working two jobs, he would volunteer to coach Little League and so on. And that the level of pressure that most people are under mean that they don't have time for the face-to-face communities that are not about politics, that are about children, that are about our community, that are about our faith, that are about things that we find are fun. Churches are collapsing. I mean, people are like increasingly not affiliating with churches, or they just sort of wander from church to church, depending on what's convenient or fun for them. And so I'd like our listeners to go back and read Robert Putnam, because he really shows how this happened. And I think if we push the internet out of the way a little bit as the culprit for all of this, we might start thinking about how to address questions of loneliness, address questions of hopelessness, address questions of friendlessness, and rebuild communities that aren't about politics or conspiracy or violence.
Absolutely.
All right, so that's what we've got for you this week, listeners. Neil, thanks so much for your wisdom.
Thank you. It was good to talk through this.
Yeah, really was. And I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Subscribe to Political Junkie Podcast on your favorite platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, image credits, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, or to subscribe for as little as $5 a month. This podcast is supported by paying subscribers to Political Junkie and the New School for Social Research. Today's theme is The Gunslinger by Ends of the Earth. You can find their work on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next time, and give your loved ones a special hug tonight.